Good morning. Thank you for the introduction, Darren. My name's Sarah Randall. I am the Assistant Director for Parking and Traffic for the London Borough of Newham, and I'm also the Chair of the TTF BPA's Smarter Parking Group, which is a mouthful in itself. I just wanted to start by finding out from the room what proportion of people are here who are from the parking side versus the highway side. So could I ask you put your hands up if you're from parking? Okay, so I'm going to say probably about 25%, and from highways? Okay, that probably makes sense knowing that there's a BPA live parking session happening in London today, which has been rearranged because of the train strikes. So it'll be interesting to know how many of you are aware of the topics I'm going to start to talk about. Okay, so I chair the Smarter Parking Group as part of the TTF, and there is a couple of key outputs that we are aiming for in the next financial year. The first one being is the successful expansion and rollout of the National Parking Platform, the MPP. And can I just get a kind of an idea of how many people in the room know what MPP is? Hey, that's not bad. That's probably about at least 50% of the room who know what National Parking Platform is. So what you're aware, I'm hoping you're aware that the pilot started in Manchester and has been rolled out, and there are plans to roll it out to another 5 local authorities with possible plans for another 10. And Keith is going to join me later and go through that in a lot more detail. But that's one of the main projects that we are trying to support as part of the Smarter Parking Group. The other part is to try and make sure that we provide information to local authorities about initiatives within smarter parking through our Smarter Streets guidance notes, which are on our website. And we're trying to do that through case studies. So one of my requests to the room would be, if you have something you're doing and you think other local authorities would be interested in it and the information, come and talk to us, because we'd love to get your notes and help write a case study to go on the system. And vice versa, if you think there's something we should put on there that's not on there, we can do that. Part of the other things kind of we touch on are, and I know there is an EV group, but EV parking, so the difference between whether or not you charge for parking at EV sites and the traffic management orders around it, digital traffic management orders, thinking about dynamic pricing and emissions-based charging, and historically maybe diesel surcharging, but I think that's now gone by the by. The action plan for the next year, we've kind of split into how we work versus the outputs we're looking for. So our aim is to try and communicate with the widest group of people we possibly can and grow our output. I think in the last 2 years, we've gone from having around 25 people to our meetings every 2 months to around 60, which is an amazing turnout. They're all online, but we are planning to do a face-to-face parking meeting for those of you who are interested later this year. We aim to create awareness around MPP, NPED, which I will talk about later, digital traffic management orders, and how we integrate all of that together, and further enhancements of the smarter parking manuals on the system. The focus of the group, again split into 4 key areas, is EV charging, and I know there is an EV charging group, but actually how parking and EV charging link in, whether or not you have timed bays and how they link into your traffic management orders, whether you charge for the parking separately to the EV charging versus it all being one consolidated cost. And the way I kind of think about that is the way you purchase goods, you don't see the VAT, you just buy one good. So actually, how do we differentiate the two to make a clear difference between the two? Curbside management, so we're talking about things like dynamic pricing, virtual TMOs, and like the work that Appyway have done on some of that to make sure that we are looking at how we maximise the data we get out of the curb space and the changes in curb space, particularly where demand is increasing but there's a finite amount of supply, and whether or not you can do virtual traffic management orders to deliver loading bays at one time of the day, coach parking at a different time of the day, and how you deliver all of that within a curbside management, which has very strict controls on the restrictions that you put on street and how we manage that moving forward. Then we go into like smarter mobility. So, and I know other groups touch on this, but how do autonomous vehicles and car clubs impact on the way in which we work in a smart way within parking, and the national parking platform and the standardisation of all the data in which we use. And then the last area, so I work for a local authority and part of my role is enforcement, is how do we tackle the enforcement side and the crime aspect. So all well and good having really great technological advancements, but there are some people who are always trying to avoid doing what we want them to do. So that's the existence of like the National Persistent Invaders Database, NPED. Just out of curiosity, how many people know what NPED is? Oh, not many. Okay. I will be talking specifically about NPED later, so you'll find out more. Digitalisation around blue badges and the crime that happens around blue badges being stolen, which I know as a London Borough has become a huge issue for us, and not often talked about, but always quite difficult, is blue badge misuse as well within that, and how can we help to manage doing that. And then the background of everything we do, the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, and making sure that we manage that successfully. So as we know that your time is limited, it's how so my next slide is all about how we're planning to communicate with those people who are interested in what we're doing. We do fortnightly meetings. We try and get the agendas out 2 weeks before so you can see what we're doing. We normally have 2 guest speakers. We try and make one of those a local authority example of what we're doing, and then a supplier comes to talk about whatever initiative they're doing. If there is things people want to see on our agenda, we are always happy to have that conversation. And then we try and provide regular updates on the projects that people are aware that we're working on, so people can see how National Parking Platform, MPEG, Appiway, all of those projects have moved through the system and what the next milestones are for what we're doing. We are going to have a roundtable conversation later on in the year in person, so if anyone's interested in attending, they can let me know. And then we're going to move forward from that. There's one thing that I'm going to make a request. So Arab are doing a survey on behalf of the Department for Transport about the National Parking Platform. We're going to send you out an email with a link, but on Arab's stall there are forms. Filling out this form determines whether you get fed lunch or not, and particularly dinner this evening. So if you really want to eat, I really would appreciate filling out these forms, just so that we get some information about where people are within that cycle. And if you're not the right person to answer, if you could tell us who the right person to answer those questions would be, that would be greatly appreciated. I'm now going to hand over to Keith for those of you who don't know, Keith Williams from Parking Matters, to talk about the National Parking Platform.
Thank you. Okay, hi. Sorry for those people who aren't involved in parking, But anyway, so National Parking Platform, it started from a standardisation, which Sarah's already mentioned, called the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, which is an international standards activity between the US, Europe and the UK. And it was partly funded by DFT, and they wanted to know whether it worked or not. So APDS does work, I can assure you. It's now an ISO standard as well, and it's also been adopted by Datex in its Part 6 parking standard. So a really good standard to know about. What is the parking platform? Well, I don't know if Andy Graham is here, I haven't seen him, but Andy Graham said, there he is right at the back, said, well, National Parking Platform, have you got a parking app in your phone? Hands up if you have. Who's got a parking app on their phone? Who's got more than one? Keep your hand up. More than 2? More than 3? Yeah? You've got a few, right? The idea behind the National Parking Platform is 2 things. It's firstly to provide a lot of information about parking, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's also to enable you to have one app that you understand and know and can be able to park and pay for it anywhere. And it's not a new idea. It's been in the Netherlands for about 10 years. And it has 3 functions. It's a contract manager. You only have to have one contract as a local authority, or even as a private operator with the national parking platform, it's a data exchange. Basically, it's infrastructure. What happens is you get your app out, you pay for parking, it goes through the national parking platform to the right parking operator, whether that's a local authority or a private organisation, so that they know you've paid and they don't enforce. And it's also a payment clearinghouse, because that can get quite complicated to know where payment's got to go. And it also, it could provide a model for things like bridge tolls and other road pricing kind of activities. And it's not a private sector thing, it's a collaboration between central and local government. The pilot is a collaboration between DFT, who are stumping up the money, thank you Graham, and Manchester City Council. So it's publicly owned and it's not for profit. And it looks a bit like this. This side at the top, you have who we call parking operators. Now, that's mostly local authorities in the UK, but not entirely. And on the bottom right, we have service providers. Now, service providers could be Ringo, pay by phone, people like that, or it could be information providers, Parkopedia, reservation services. All sorts of different people provide services around parking. And the concept is that each of them has one contract with the national parking platform and can exchange data with the national parking platform. And the consequence of that is that you, me, everybody else, the customer, actually gets a better service and an easier to use service, and Mr. Gove doesn't have to write any letters. All right? So he does it in 3 ways. If I can get this to work. There we go. So the first is around information on parking. So when you join the national parking platform as a parking operator, you put your information into the system. You say, this is where our parking is, this is how much it costs, this is when it's open. And the national parking platform aggregates all that information so that a service provider, so pay by mobile, information service, whoever, can pick up that information and advise their customer where parking is and how much it's going to be, what's the best parking for the journey they're going to make. All right? And then when the customer actually arrives, then they interact with their service provider. They don't interact with the national parking platform or the parking operator, they interact with their service provider. And as they pay their service provider, that information gets put into national parking platform and then gets bounced along until it appears on the handheld that your friendly CEO uses, and they know that that particular vehicle has made a payment with Just Park, whoever. All right? And this is actually operating now. It's been operating in Manchester since September 2021, and it's now also in Coventry, in Cheshire West and Chester, and in Oxfordshire as well. And it's about to be rolled out in Camden. So it's not a theoretical thing, this is really happening. And that is a pilot programme, as I said, DFT and Manchester City Council have been running. And the only difference is that the NPP eventually has to be an entity in its own right. And at the moment, my organisation, Parking Matters, is acting as a proxy for that, which means that we can't do this bit. And this bit is the money bit. So essentially what happens is you take the money on a daily basis, that gets all put into the platform's bank account, and then the platform gives each operator the amount of money that they're entitled to and a reconciliation file. So it simplifies the actual processing of payments as well. So that works in 3 ways. So you've got the information thing at the top, that's use case 0. It's use case 0 because it was the first one we did. All right, so, and then there is also payment on arrival. That's when you stop at the side of the road, pick up your app and you pay for 2 hours or whatever, you pay when you arrive. But we also have some other things which are slightly less well developed, but we are working on the moment, one of which is frictionless payment. You've probably all experienced this already because there are loads of people where you can drive up to the barrier opens, and you drive out, you don't even think about paying. But this is doing it on a multi-vendor basis. So the same people you now use to pay at the side of the road, you can use in a barrier-controlled car park or in ANPR-controlled car park. So we're working on that one. It's not live anywhere yet, but it very nearly is. And then the last one is a sort of halfway house. So when you go into a pay for a car park, instead of going to the machine, you get out your favourite app, you pay on that, you leave, you don't have to queue. There is also now use case 4, fifth use case 4. We're working with TFGM, we've been given a little bit more money by DFT and OZEV. And the idea is to take EV charging information and add it into that parking locations bit we were talking about in the first place. So if you are someone who wants to park and charge, then your service provider can pick up that information from both the charge point operators and the parking platform. And sorry for this is a slightly technical diagram because we're using the charge point standard, OCPI. We're taking that information and we're putting it alongside the APDS information in our output, in our API to service providers. And the idea is that we can talk about what locations also have charge points, and we can talk about whether they're working or not, which is quite an important issue. So for those people who aren't parking people, there is a relevance to you here because the National Parking Platform is going to have loads of information about journey endpoints. And I mean a lot, because eventually pretty much every transaction, because the P&D people, Michael Go's friends, they are also putting their information into the parking platform. So it will have a record of pretty much every parking transaction there is to be had, which is useful information for you guys as well. So there is a relevance. And the parking platform pilot is what I'm working on. And these are all the people we're talking to. So on the left are all the service providers who are taking payment or giving information. In the middle are all the equipment providers and a few private operators. And then on the right-hand side, the big square there are all the local authorities and public sector organisations that we are talking to. And that's not all of them, in fact. There's quite a lot. And as I said, we have 5 pilots either happening or just about to happen. We've been given money this year for another 10 pilots. So if you're a local authority who's interested and you haven't spoken to me, I'm around. And then on the right-hand side are all those organisations that have declared an interest and said, yes, we'd like to develop an integration into the parking platform. And because it's using APDS standards, once you've developed that, you can use that same interface for all sorts of other things as well. We can discuss that at another time. And this is where we're at the moment. So, start off on the left-hand side. 2020, we started the project. We first went live in Manchester in 2021. We are actually, that's out of date, we're actually at about 700,000 transactions a month that we're passing through the platform. And one of the key things here is that the challenge is not really technical. APDS has helped us with that, and it means that that's relatively straightforward. The challenge here is about contracts and making sure that the contracts all work because we're exchanging money. Very different from, if you're in roads, you don't have to think about money too much. Changing hands at the moment, that's very easy. I mean, if you get to road pricing, God help you. So the next bit will be building that central entity, that company that I was talking about that will become the National Parking Platform itself. And at that point, it will become self-financing. And each transaction, each payment transaction, the operator will have to pay for. Really expensive. 1 pence a transaction to start with, and probably by the time we get the kind of volume that the Dutch have got, we're down to 0.5 pence a transaction. It's very cheap to do this with at these kind of levels of transactions. And then from around about mid-2024, that full platform will be live and will be up and running. I think that's probably about it.
The last thing I'd probably say on all of that is, as a local authority, the fact that you wouldn't have to continually go through procurement, and actually once you've joined the platform, that's it in terms of your procurement, solves multiple problems for a longevity, which makes it cost effective to do. Next thing I'm going to talk to you about, for those who aren't aware, is National Persistent Evaders Database, which is being set up. So I work as part of my role is enforcement, and one of the things that we're probably seeing an increasing trend in is the number of vehicles that aren't complying with either with the DVLA, with road tax, insurance, and just the problems with vehicles that don't conform to those standards. So within Newham, we do probably 25% of all the removals in London, and we're seeing an increase in the number of vehicles that are being cloned. So that for me, I've now started to classify cloned vehicles in two different categories. There's the cloned vehicles that I would say are being cloned to be stolen, and they tend to be without any prejudice, Range Rover type vehicles, the high-end vehicles. And then we're seeing an increase in the number of vehicles that are being cloned by people themselves so that they can drive through more AMPR locations like healthy school streets, low traffic neighbourhoods and LTNs. And that flip in the number of vehicles that are now becoming more challenging to enforce is increasing in numbers. Part of the challenge with that is some of the responsibility for this doesn't sit within a parking authority, it sits with the police. And it's how do we manage that challenge to try and get everyone to tackle the problem as we are. So the value for MPED is the local authorities or the issuing authority if you're a private company, local and national policing and communities, we look at what we're going to do, because what we're aware of is most of the vehicles that we are trying to tackle to take off the road are probably causing the air pollution. They don't meet the standards. So in terms of road safety and the drivers of those vehicles, they tend to cause more problems. And what we tend to see is when you stop the vehicles, the probability of there being other criminality issues around drugs or crime are exceptionally high. And the antisocial behaviour of those drivers in general is exceptionally high. How it works. So you have local authorities who are feeding in at the moment. So we've started to do this. There's a pilot being run by with Alan Wood from Just and the Ministry of Justice, and looking at some of the East London boroughs, so Newham, Havering, Barking and Dagenham and Essex, because what we're seeing is the vehicles that are contravening in my borough are also contravening in all of the other boroughs, and it's the impact that that then has of their continued behaviour all the way through. We're feeding in our information about persistent offenders and evaders into the database, and we're then feeding that into the information around whether or not those vehicles have road tax, I would say insurance, but insurance is slightly different, but whether they've got road tax or are MOT'd, or whether the police are aware of any criminality associated with that number plate, and then trying to look at patterns within that data. We've then started to kind of categorise the vehicles. No. Bear with me. Oh. Yeah. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of fun here. Okay.
It's a great animation.
We then started to categorise the vehicles into a number of key areas. So those vehicles that have over 50 outstanding PCNs across that partnership, that have no vehicle excise duty, no MOT and no insurance, and quite often, all right, I've now lost that completely. It would do, wouldn't it? Okay, I will talk. So we started to categorise the vehicles into 5 key categories. So category A, those people with over 50 PCNs outstanding, no vehicle MOT insurance or duty. Category B, those with 10 plus PCNs. Category C, which are just our standard persistent evaders with 3 PCNs. Category D, those with 3 outstanding PCNs but no warrant, and those people who don't fall into any of those categories. Because what I'm conscious of is I know within my local authority there are a small minority of people who are clocking up over 300 PCNs every month. On top of that, there's those people we can't issue the PCNs to in the first place because we have no registered DVLA details. And not only are they doing it in my borough, when you then start to look at that corridor into London, they're doing it across all of us. So it's a real key scoring matrix to see how we tackle the worst performers within the market. What's next? It's looking at how we cost so first of all, it's looking at phase one, at the moment we pay £9 in tech costs for every warrant we issue. Actually, I issue, within Newham, we'll issue 3 warrants until we see one of them paid. But if every local authority is issuing 3 warrants to a persistent offender and evader, actually that cost tallies up, and how can we reduce that down so we reduce down the cost for everyone else? 2, how we tackle the unregistered vehicles and actually get them removed off street so that actually they can't continually offend. The cloning of vehicles and looking at how we tackle those vehicles. So I see probably 30% of all the vehicles we're now removing off street are cloned in one way or another, and tackling those cloned vehicles in particular. And actually cloners are getting smart, so they choose a number plate of a similar vehicle in a similar colour. So actually, when you're taking the photos or looking at it, it's very hard initially to spot. It's things like roof racks or stickers that actually mean you can distinguish the vehicles in general. Foreign registered vehicles, particularly those that are here for a long period of time. In London, we've seen an increase in the number of foreign plated vehicles that we are seeing as persistent offenders. No MOT. Then using all of that to analyse the data we've got and try and trace back to the last registered keeper of the vehicle and see whether or not we have any forwarding details. And then a hot list of what we're doing. And then linking all of that back into the police and DVLA so we can tackle the worst of the offenders of that. That's it on National MPED. So if anyone has any questions, I would happily answer them. Any questions?
Well, going back to the national parking platform, is it actually possible to actually integrate with it to get information, or is that a kind of sort of thing where you've got to pay in order to register or stuff like that?
Are you a service provider or an operator? Are you a supplier or a local authority?
I'm someone who dabbles with apps.
You're someone who dabbles with apps, okay. The answer to that question is we will give you, as the pilot, a free token to be able to see data, as long as you have the right to that data. So you'd have to get permission from, say, a local authority or a service provider. But no, we're not charging for integration as part of the pilot. The business case that we're working on at the moment means that probably local authorities who come on board after the pilot will get charged about 10 grand. And service providers probably will have to pay about 20 grand a year if they are taking payments. But we haven't decided what the people like information services are going to have to pay.
I see. And at the moment, does the data cover all parking in the UK?
No, the data is brought on. So, for example, when Coventry joined, we put all Coventry's parking into the platform. There are some other places, TFGM, Hull, who aren't on part of the multi-vendor payment. Their parking is also on as well. So it's a pilot. It's relatively small at the moment, but it would become national, comprehensive. If you look at the Netherlands, where it's been going for about 12 years, 98% of all local authorities are on the platform, and they've always focused on public sector. They're now starting to look at private sector, and they've got about 30% of private sector on as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Tim, there's a question.
I don't know, should be able to hear it the end way. Sorry. No, it's just worth also pointing out, it's an old Coventry City Council, that we are, the reason we are doing this is all the presentations this morning about autonomy and how we connect autonomous vehicles. This is going to be beneficial for that development as well, because how do you get an autonomous vehicle to pay for parking when it doesn't have a driver in there? So hence the reason for supporting actually making sure that we do integrate everything else, including EV bays. So I think it was just worth mentioning that, and then the reason for joining the development.
Yeah, absolutely, Sunil. The other thing to say is that there are also connections between this and digital TROs as well. So APDS is about permitted parking, whereas obviously when it comes to parking, TROs are about restrictions as well. So the MPP will never be the digital TRO centre, but it will always talk about parking that's permitted and possibly parking that is sort of permitted. Things like disabled parking and so on will be in there as well. And as the descriptions become better, then it will become better on the MPP. At the moment, all we have is a latitude, longitude of, say, the entrance to a car park or the centre of a set of bays on street. And that will have to improve as we get towards autonomous vehicles. But it's going to be a while, I think, so we've got a bit of time.
Is it on?
No.
I'm Robert from Innovate UK. Thank you for your sort of parking explanation. Additional to that, what Sunil said about the autonomous vehicles, I'm working with the CCAV fund, and what I sense from this is that it's a really good activity, but you're missing this big opportunity for driver assist or self-parking of vehicles. I know it's a little bit more mid-term, but the industry's been facing a massive challenge to explain the benefits of autonomous vehicles to the general public. All of these car makers have developed AVP. It's a standard function, but nobody can commercialise it. Why can they not commercialise it? Because there's no operators that are willing to implement a system like AVP. I think in the UK, we could be the first to implement such a system with a commercial operator, parking operator. We have a test bed that could to test an AVP system, and it could be a massive service value to the high-end domestic car market. The reason I mention that is because Bosch have been pushing many times to us to get AVP into the UK market, but there's no operator. So how can that fit into this activity? I think it's a good use case.
Yeah, I'm involved in the European AVP activity, right? So I could bore you for hours on that one. But headlines are, if the UK wants to be ahead, they're going to have to get their finger out, because there are quite a few pilots already coming online in places like Stuttgart and so on. But you're right in the sense that what we're doing in the standardization community is we're bringing together APDS and the ISO standard for AVP as well, so that if you reserve a space, for example, that would be an APDS, and then the information would flow into the AVP standard when the car turns up at the parking spot, right? And so there is definitely a synergy between the two. Because APDS underlies MPP, we're not losing an opportunity. It's there if there is a service provider who wants to pick it up. We know Bosch. It's really within the frictionless parking sort of use case rather than EV. But I would urge any parking operator that's interested to get in touch with either me or someone from the AVP group, because Bosch is one company that's trying to look for a site in the UK. There's another one as well. So there are lots of opportunities around for that kind of thing. Very good.
Willem. Sorry, one just down here.
Hi, Kieran. How does the data get from NPED to the police, and what data goes there, and what happens with it?
So at the moment it's down to, so I can speak on behalf of Newham, we are manually downloading the data out of our database and providing it to NPED to put it in, and then we're having, it's not an automated system at the moment. That's the link we're trying to work on to see how we link that up and how. So when you look at the persistent invaders legislation, it's a little bit clunky in the way in which it works. It talks about bonds and how you tackle that. A lot of what we've got to do is, Alan and I have re-looked at some of the wording which we've then given back of that legislation to see how we can make it work as a user case for individuals, to make it smoother and more in line with the way in which we work for PCNs and stuff. So at the moment it's still being built, but there are conversations with how we have that data interface linked in. So some of the information like MOT and road tax, we can set up links to do that automatically. The insurance industry is a lot more complicated because they're held by private companies and they're not quite as willing to share the information, and that's when you're then reliant on police to do it. Initially, a lot of it is going to be kind of standoff operations on an individual day, using the information we get from civil enforcement officers on a daily basis to go and tackle those, and using the ANPR technology, because actually the cloning of vehicles and ANPR, that's where you're seeing the vast increase in misuse. And because they're driving through, you don't ever normally issue a PCN on street or know where that person is going to and from, which is why it makes it quite interesting seeing where they drive through Havering or Barking and Dagenham or Essex, because there is definitely a corridor into London where people are using that behaviour, and seeing if we can then track down where the cars are actually situated so that we can then take some enforcement action.
Follow on to that then. Is this something where it's a case of you collecting the data you can, handing it off to the police, and then they handling it? Or is it something that requires ongoing, through case joint management of the stuff?
Joint management. So data changes all the time. So in Newham, we issue 340,000 PCNs a year. There's a number of PCNs we don't issue because they are done by ANPR and there's no registered keeper with the DVLA. So actually we have a huge amount of data, and that data changes every month. And one of the things that you notice is there are definitely trends in the vehicles. So just because a vehicle was a persistent offender last year doesn't mean that this year they're going to be this. They could, but quite often the vehicles are at the end of their life vehicles, and therefore people move on to new vehicles. And so it's a constant change. And actually I think what Alan's looking to do is to make sure that that's a constant data flow, versus at the moment where it's a very manual, I download my information, it goes in, and then you get the outputs.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the things that's kind of underlying that question as well is about data privacy. And just to assure you that behind both the MPED and also the MPP, we're doing a lot of work on data privacy and ensuring that data privacy rules are maintained, and that people's data isn't going to be at risk.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.